far beyond the reach of the established colonial corridors, in that endless cold silence where no trade route dared to wander. A Weyland-Yutani exploration vessel drifted through the black. Its designation was quiet, its mission unremarkable on paper, its crew half asleep in their cryopods. The stars outside its home moved with the slow indifference of things that had watched empires rise and rot without ever blinking. In that darkness, the ship's long-range instruments picked up something they were never meant to hear. A signal. Faint, broken, older than it had any right to be. Rising from the surface of a dead moon that had been struck from every corporate map more than 3 decades ago. The moon was not supposed to exist anymore. Not in any meaningful way. It had been quietly abandoned during a wave of corporate restructuring, its name buried in classified archives, its coordinates scrubbed from every navigational chart accessible to civilian pilots. There had been rumors, of course, the kind whispered by dock workers on distant stations, but rumors were currency in the outer colonies, and no one paid much attention to them. Yet here the signal was, patient and cold, calling from a world that no living human was supposed to remember. The transmission carried no recognizable human language. It was a wound rather than a message. Distorted screams layered upon coordinates, coordinates layered upon a single repeating phrase buried so deep beneath the static that the ship's translation matrix could only offer fragments. The linguists who studied the recording later would say the phrase felt older than words, as if something had been trying to speak long before there were mouths to shape sound. Weyland-Yutani's response was predictable. Curiosity in the corporation's dictionary had always been another word for opportunity. Within hours, a small recovery team was dispatched from the vessel, their orders sanitized and brief. Investigate. Report. They expected to find the remains of engineered technology, perhaps another dormant biological specimen, another quiet fortune waiting in the dust. They did not expect the moon to be watching them back. The recovery team descended through a sky the color of dried blood. Their dropship landed on a plateau of black stone that seemed to drink the light from their floodlights. They moved in tight formation, weapons drawn, breath fogging inside their helmets. The abandoned colony rose around them like the ribcage of some enormous animal, its towers half collapsed, its walls scarred by decades of storms. And beneath the wreckage, they found a doorway that should not have been there. A doorway carved into the bedrock itself. They followed it downward. The corridors grew stranger as they went. Symbols crawled across the walls, spirals and glyphs that felt half-remembered by a species that had never learned them. The air tasted of iron and old rain. Somewhere far below, water dripped in a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. At the end of the descent, they found the chamber. An enormous vaulted hall lined with stone that predated humanity, its ceiling lost in shadow. Its floor patterned with markings that seemed to shift when no one looked at them directly. For a long moment, the team simply stood there, forgetting their orders, forgetting the corporation, forgetting the surface. Then the walls moved. What they had mistaken for shadow began to detach itself from the stone. Long, sleek, dripping. The xenomorphs poured from every crack in every ceiling, and the chamber that had felt like a cathedral became a slaughterhouse in the space of a single breath. Rifles fired blindly. Acid blood sprayed. Men screamed into their radios and heard only static in return. The expedition collapsed inward on itself, 5 bodies, then 4, then 2, until only a handful of survivors huddled behind the broken remains of a fallen pillar with their ammunition almost gone and their courage entirely spent. They believed they were about to die. They accepted it, in the strange calm that comes to those who have finally run out of options. And then the darkness beyond the chamber began to burn. A low sound rolled through the tunnels behind them. Not a growl, not a scream. Something mechanical, something ancient, something that did not belong in any catalog of known dangers. It was the sound of an engine. A single roaring motorcycle engine, its echo climbing the walls, its heat reaching them long before its shape did. Fire rushed up the corridor like a living tide. The xenomorphs turned toward it, hissing, confused, their sleek heads tilting in that terrible bird-like way. And then the fire arrived. He came through the smoke on a motorcycle wrapped in living flame. His body was a skeleton wreathed in leather. His skull was a torch. His chains dragged across the stone floor and left burning grooves behind them. The chamber that had been a cathedral, that had become a slaughterhouse, was suddenly filled with a light that had no origin, a light that seemed to remember every sin ever committed within reach of it. The survivors could only stare. They did not have a word for what they were seeing. But somewhere in the deepest part of the human mind, older than language, an instinct spoke plainly. Judgment. Ghost Rider had entered the alien universe. The Xenomorphs did what they were built to do. They attacked. They came from every direction, without hesitation, without fear, because fear was a thing they had been designed to produce, not to feel. The first drone struck the rider's chest at full speed. The flames welcomed it. The second sprayed acid across his shoulder. The fire drank the acid and grew brighter. The third landed on his back and sank its inner jaw into the base of his neck. And the rider turned his burning skull toward it, slowly, patiently, and looked into the smooth black surface of its head. Something impossible happened. The Xenomorph froze. The Xenomorph shuddered. And then the Xenomorph, the creature that had never retreated from anything in the long, dark history of its kind, released its grip, dropped to the floor, and crawled backward into the shadow from which it had come. The survivors did not understand what they had just witnessed. They only understood that they were alive, and that the thing which had spared them was still standing in the middle of the chamber, watching the darkness with the slow patience of a creature that had all the time in the world. Their radios crackled back to life as if the fire itself had cleared a path through the static. Somewhere above the moon, orders were already being drafted. Somewhere in the distant orbital command decks of Weyland-Yutani, a red flag had begun to blink. To the corporation, everything unknown was a resource waiting to be classified. The initial reports reached executive channels within the hour, and by the time the survivors were dragging themselves back toward the ruined dropship, a full security detachment was already burning through the void toward them. Armored transports, containment specialists, xenobiologists with sealed briefcases full of instruments that had never been used on anything remotely like what waited for them below. They believed they were responding to a biological event. They believed the burning figure was another leaked specimen, some deep archive project that had slipped its chains during the chaos. They believed, as the corporation had always believed, that anything which walked in fire could be caged in steel. Their mistake was elegant in its simplicity. They had assumed Ghost Rider was a creature. He was not. He was a sentence being carried out. Above ground, the abandoned colony began to wake. Emergency lights flickered on across long, dead corridors. Doors that had been sealed for decades ground open under the pressure of arriving corporate teams. And beneath it all, moving through the lower levels with a quiet certainty that felt almost ceremonial, the rider began to walk. His motorcycle rested somewhere in the deep tunnels, silent for now, waiting. He did not need it here. He needed only his senses, and those senses were tuned to something no scanner in Weyland-Yutani's arsenal could measure. He was following the scent of innocent lives that had been extinguished within these walls. The moon's history began to unfold around him like a wound reopening. Every hallway remembered. Every scorched panel, every dried blood stain, every scratched message on a wall spoke of the same story. Years earlier, long before the moon had been officially abandoned, this colony had been the site of a research program buried so deep in Weyland-Yutani's black budget that even most of the company's own board had never seen its name. They had been experimenting with xenomorph genetics. They had been splicing those genetics with fragments of recovered engineer technology. Their goal had been a controllable organism, a biological weapon capable of surviving vacuum, radiation, and the ambitions of the corporation that owned it. The results had been catastrophic. Hundreds of colonists, most of them families who had come here believing they were signing on for standard mining contracts, had been used as involuntary hosts. Some had been killed in the initial containment breaches. Others had been used as living data points long after the first outbreaks. The corporation had ended the project by ending the colony, then had ended the colony by ending its existence in the official record. The moon had become a ghost, and Ghost Rider, walking through the ruins now, saw the truth of every silence. He did not need anyone to explain what had happened here. He never did. The evidence spoke in a language his kind had been listening to for a very long time. The children's shoes half buried in the dust of an evacuation corridor that had never been used. The rows of empty cryopods with their locks welded shut from the outside. The name scratched into a wall behind a fallen medical cabinet, written by someone who had wanted to be remembered even though no one was coming for them. Every sign he passed sharpened his purpose. He was not on this moon to hunt monsters. He was on this moon to hunt the men who had made monsters necessary. Meanwhile, in the ceilings above him, the Xenomorph hive had begun to change its posture. The queen at the heart of the deep tunnels had felt the death of her drone during the first encounter, and she had felt the retreat of another, and both experiences had confused her. Her kind did not retreat. Her kind did not fail to kill. Her kind did not shudder at the sight of anything living. Yet the images being fed back to her through the shared instinct of the hive contained a shape her ancient mind could not parse. So she did what her ancient mind knew how to do when confronted with a mystery. She sent more. Drones began tracking Ghost Rider through the walls, moving in silence, timing their footsteps to the drip of pipes, positioning themselves in the vents so that any direction he turned would be the wrong one. Their hive intelligence tried to build a profile of the intruder the way it had built profiles of countless prey species before. It looked for warmth signatures. It found only cold. It looked for a heartbeat. It found only fire. It looked for the small chemical exhalations that all living things produced when hunted, the sweat of fear, the acid of adrenaline, the pheromones of a body that knew it was being watched. It found nothing. Ghost Rider passed through the corridors of the colony, leaving no biological trace at all. To the hive, he was less than a shadow. He was a hole in the world where a target should have been. Heat did not scare him. Darkness did not conceal them from him. Numbers did not overwhelm him. And when the first true confrontation finally came, deep in the underground tunnels beneath the old refinery, the hive learned something that no Xenomorph had ever needed to learn before. The warrior came from the ceiling. It dropped without warning, the way its kind had dropped on soldiers and settlers and dreamers for generations, and its inner jaw struck exactly where a human throat would have been. Ghost Rider caught it in midair. One skeletal hand closed around the smooth black skull. The other closed around the whipping tail. He held the creature suspended for a long, quiet moment, and the fire in his eyes reflected in the polished carapace of its face. The Xenomorph thrashed. It shrieked. It sprayed its acid blood across his shoulders and watched the fire drink every drop. It tried, in the only way its kind knew how to try, to be terrifying. It could not, because fear was its weapon, and its weapon had never before met a being that had already burned every fear out of itself long ago. Ghost Rider looked into the creature's face the way a judge looks into a defendant's file. There was no hatred in him. There was no cruelty. There was only a decision. When his hands finally closed, the sound that echoed through the tunnels was not a scream. It was the quiet final noise of a sentence being completed. Somewhere far above, in her chamber of resin and bone, the queen felt another of her children go dark. And for the first time in the long history of her species, she began to feel something that had no name. Something that only prey had ever felt before. The queen had lived a long time by the measure of her species. She had birthed generations. She had watched worlds burn and reform. She had reached her long, articulated fingers into the memories of every creature her hive had ever consumed, and from those memories she had built a private library of terror, a catalog of the many small ways in which soft things died. She had believed she understood the shape of every threat in the universe. But something was walking through her tunnels now that fit none of the entries in her library. Something that did not sweat, did not bleed properly, did not breathe. Something that answered her ambushes with fire and her fear with judgment. So she changed her tactics, not because she had planned to, because she had to. For the first time in a very long time, the queen was no longer setting the terms of the hunt. She began coordinating. Not the loose, instinctive coordination her species had always practiced, but something tighter, something almost strategic. Drones stopped attacking individually. They began moving in waves, 3 at a time, then 6, then 12. They began herding rather than pouncing. They began targeting escape routes rather than throats. She was learning, and her hive was learning with her. And by the time Ghost Rider reached the surface of the colony's central plaza, hundreds of Xenomorphs were pouring into the ruined streets from every side. They came from the collapsed towers. They came from the sewer grates. They came from the ceiling of the abandoned market, dropping in silent lines like black rain. The plaza that had once held food stalls and worn stone benches became a moving carpet of chitin and teeth. Any ordinary creature would have been buried in the first 10 seconds. Ghost Rider met them on his motorcycle. He rode straight into the wave. The bike's front wheel struck the first drone at full speed and folded it in half in a spray of acid and bone. The chain in his hand ignited as he swung it, carving glowing arcs through the air, wrapping around limbs, tearing away heads. Every strike left a burning wound. Every wound left a mark that no xenomorph body could repair. The plaza filled with the reek of scorched carapace and the shriek of dying instinct. And in the center of the chaos rode a burning skull that never once looked away from its purpose. But this was where the hive learned its next lesson, and where Ghost Rider began to reveal the truth of what he was. Because he did not destroy indiscriminately. He never had. His fire was not a wildfire. It was a scalpel. Even in the middle of that impossible battle, his eyes tracked something the hive had not expected him to notice. A cluster of small figures huddled behind an overturned transport near the far wall of the plaza. Colonists. Human beings who had somehow been hiding in the ruins of their own broken home for far longer than anyone had believed possible. They had been convinced they would die there. They had made their peace with it, the way people do when hope becomes a language they can no longer speak. And now they watched a demon on a motorcycle carve a corridor through the swarm, deliberately, patiently, guiding the killing so that not a single drone reached them. The chains cut down anything that turned toward the transport. The fire burned brightest wherever the hive tried to advance in their direction. It became clear, in a way that felt almost blasphemous to them, that the burning thing was protecting them. Among those survivors was a young Weyland-Yutani technician named Ava. She had come to this moon with a corporate contract and a set of quiet illusions about the company she worked for. Both had died within her first week. She had spent the months since then hiding, scavenging, watching her friends be taken one by one, and telling herself that the universe simply did not care. Now she watched a creature made of fire carve open a path through the impossible and thought, for the first time in a long time, that perhaps the universe was not indifferent. Perhaps it was simply slow. And when it finally arrived, it arrived on wheels. She was the one who moved first. She grabbed the shoulders of the older colonists around her and pushed them toward the corridor Ghost Rider had made. They ran. They ran across a plaza filled with dying monsters, past chains still glowing red, past the great burning wheels of a motorcycle that seemed to notice their passage and adjusted its position slightly to shield them. They ran until they reached the far side, and then they kept running. Ava looked back once. She would remember what she saw for the rest of her life. Not the monsters. Not the fire. The stillness of the figure in the center of it. He was not raging. He was working. To Weyland-Yutani, watching from the command decks above, Ghost Rider was a weapon. Something to be captured, decoded, mass-produced. To the Xenomorphs, whose ancient hive intelligence had finally begun to accept what its senses had been telling it, Ghost Rider was an impossible predator. Something outside the natural order of prey and hunter. To Ava Reyes and the small handful of survivors she led into the tunnels beyond the plaza, he was slowly becoming something none of them had a word for yet. A judgment that judged in their favor. A story they would carry back into the world if the world ever let them return to it. The Queen, watching through the eyes of her drones, understood only that her attacks had failed, so she reached deeper. She sent for one of her true weapons. From the darkest levels of the hive, a Praetorian answered her call. It was enormous, the size of 3 normal drones stacked together, its crown of horns spread wide like a black cathedral. It had killed corporate response teams. It had shattered walls. It had crushed exosuits with its bare limbs. It emerged into the plaza with a bellow that rattled the collapsed towers, and it went straight for the burning rider. The battle that followed tore through 3 levels of the colony. The Praetorian struck like a battering ram, and Ghost Rider met it with the full weight of his motorcycle at full speed. They crashed through a wall together. They fell into an old storage bay. The Praetorian's tail caved in a support beam. Ghost Rider's chain shattered a row of cryogenic tanks. They fell again down a service shaft into the deep manufacturing tunnels below. Every collision left a crater. Every breath the creature took filled the corridor with acid mist. Every strike Ghost Rider landed with his chain left a molten scar along its armored shell. The Praetorian eventually fell. It took long minutes. It took the burning of chains and the shattering of stone. It took every ounce of the creature's monstrous strength turned into slow, patient exhaustion by an opponent who did not tire. When at last the great head sank to the tunnel floor, Ghost Rider stood over it in silence, chains dripping fire onto the corpse. He did not celebrate. He simply listened. Because beneath the tunnels, deeper than the deepest level of the hive, something ancient had begun to stir. The battle had disturbed it. The hive itself, he realized now, had been built directly above an engineer structure older than the corporation, older than the colony, older than the human idea of history. And whatever slept inside that structure had just opened one eye. Ava and her survivors did not find the engineer archive on purpose. They stumbled into it the way people always stumble into truths that were never meant for them, half-broken, out of breath, driven forward by the simple animal need to keep moving. The tunnel they had followed away from the plaza narrowed and then opened again into a vaulted room whose walls curved upward like the inside of a rib cage. The stone was smooth and dark, and along its surface ran veins of a metal that seemed to pulse faintly, the way old scars sometimes ache when the weather changes. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and above the pedestal hovered a slow, patient light. The light responded to their presence. It did not care that they were human. It did not care that thousands of years had passed since the last hand had approached it. It simply began to speak in a language that had no sound, projecting images into the air above the pedestal that their minds interpreted as memory. They understood without understanding. They saw without seeing. They watched a history that had never been written down because the beings who lived it had not survived long enough to write it. The engineers had come here first. Long before humanity had learned to shape fire, long before the first human word had ever been spoken, tall, pale figures in ceremonial armor had walked these tunnels with instruments in their hands and questions on their minds. They were not gods, though later species would mistake them for such. They were builders. They were meddlers. They were a civilization that had reached the point where curiosity had begun to outweigh caution, and they had come to this moon because the moon had contained something interesting. The holograms showed the engineers descending into the deep structure beneath the colony. They showed them mapping its corridors, cataloging its chambers, running their long fingers along walls that predated their own history. And then they showed the first engineer to reach the deepest chamber falling to his knees, not in worship, but in recognition. He had found something older than his people, something that did not belong to the physical order of the universe in any way his instruments could measure, something that had been sleeping in the moon long before the moon had cooled into stone. They did not name it. In the recording, they refused to name it, but they described what it did. It fed. It fed slowly, indirectly, on the great engine of biological suffering. Wars in nearby systems fed it. Famines fed it. The small daily cruelties of intelligent species fed it. It did not act. It did not need to act. It only needed the universe to continue being the universe. And it grew stronger with every act of violence committed within a radius its own creators could not measure. The engineers, in the arrogance that would later become their epitaph, decided they could use it. They began to experiment. They tried to distill its essence into a substance they could weaponize, and the substance came to be known, in the whispered records of every species that later encountered it, as the black goo. They tried to shape organisms that could carry that essence forward in a controllable form, and one of those attempts, one of many, became the Xenomorph. The perfect predator, they had believed. A biological expression of the entity's hunger, contained inside a body that could be studied and reproduced. They believed they had solved a problem no other civilization had dared to touch. They had not solved it. They had only opened the door a little wider. The recording showed the moment the engineers realized their error. They had begun to notice, decades into the project, that the entity was not being contained by the experiments. It was being extended by them. Every xenomorph they created was another mouth. Every drop of black goo they synthesized was another root. The thing beneath the moon was not their prisoner. It was their partner, and they had been feeding it for so long that they had forgotten how to stop. The final holograms were the shortest. They showed the surviving engineers evacuating the moon in silence, sealing the deep chamber behind them with wards they no longer trusted, and leaving the whole world marked in their own records as a place that must never be revisited. Then humanity had come. Ava sank to the floor with the light of the archive still washing across her face. The others sat with her. They did not speak. There was nothing to say that the images had not already said. Their corporation had reopened a door the engineers themselves had been terrified to close. Their corporation had made those same mistakes again, with less caution and less humility, in the pursuit of the same fantasy of control. Elsewhere in the ruins, Ghost Rider stood in front of the sealed structure the engineers had left behind. He did not need the holograms. He recognized the energy leaking through the cracks in the stone. It was not the fire of hell. It was not the cold intelligence of the demons he had spent so many lives dismantling. It was something more primal, something that had existed before the first covenant was ever broken between a mortal and something older than mortals. But it carried the same fundamental corruption. It fed on the same currency. The slow spiritual erosion of intelligent beings who had been convinced that their small evils did not matter. He understood then why he had been drawn here. The signal that had reached the corporate ship had not been meant for the corporation. It had been meant for him. Something in the deep places of the universe had been calling for judgment for a very long time, and his kind had finally arrived to answer. Above the moon in the sterile boardrooms of Orbital Command, other decisions were being made. Weyland-Yutani's executives had listened to the reports from the surface with a kind of terrible enthusiasm. The dead colony was not, as they had feared, an embarrassment. It was an opportunity. A live specimen of an unknown supernatural entity, plus a functioning xenomorph hive, plus an untapped engineer structure. Any one of those discoveries would have justified the entire moon's cost 100 times over. Together they represented, in the language of corporate ambition, the ultimate weapons platform. The order was given. Reopen the facility. Reinforce the security. Bring in the specialists. Do not destroy anything. Study. The men and women who signed those orders did not believe in irony. They did not believe in curses. They did not believe in old sins waiting for the right moment to complete themselves. They believed only in acquisition. They believed only in leverage. They believed they had discovered the key to controlling monsters. Deep beneath their orbital platforms, in a chamber older than their species, the thing that had been sleeping smiled with a mouth that had never existed, because they had not discovered a key at all. They were the key, and they had just turned in a lock that had been waiting for a very long time. The Operation Weyland-Yutani launched against the moon was the largest deployment of private military assets in the corporation's recorded history, though of course nothing about it would ever appear in a recorded history. Dropships came down in staggered waves, their engines burning the ash of the ruined colony into wide black rings. Armored vehicles rolled off their ramps in silent columns. Containment pods, some the size of small buildings, were positioned in a ring around the deep structure. And walking among all of it unaffected by the acrid wind were the soldiers themselves, wearing suits of matte black armor whose design had never been seen on any battlefield. These were not standard corporate mercenaries. They were the specialists that Weyland-Yutani kept behind sealed doors for exactly the kind of situation no shareholder was ever supposed to hear about. Their weapons were experimental. Pulse projectors that could shatter internal organs without breaking skin. Coherent light lances built to penetrate armor no known creature possessed. And above all, a new class of ordnance developed in emergency sessions during the past 48 hours specifically for the purpose of incapacitating a single burning man on a motorcycle. Freeze round, nullifier grenade. Cold storage capsules built to hold something that had walked out of a chamber unharmed by acid and fire. They believed they had prepared. They had studied every piece of surveillance footage. They had reviewed the encounters between Ghost Rider and the Xenomorph warriors. They had analyzed his responses, his patterns, his silences. They had concluded that any entity could be contained if enough force was applied intelligently. They had been trained by their corporation to believe this since their first day of employment. And they were not the only element of the plan. In the deep tunnels below the surface, another team of specialists was doing something even more foolish. Weyland-Yutani scientists had decided that the containment of Ghost Rider would be dramatically, Simpler if the moon's other predator was suddenly given every possible reason to attack him at once. So they were, with slow and deliberate care, waking the parts of the hive that had been dormant since the original colony had fallen. Chemical stimulants were pumped into the tunnels. Pheromone bursts designed to imitate the death cries of the queen's own children were broadcast at frequencies only the hive could hear. Old resin nests were carefully perforated to expose the sleeping bodies within them to fresh air and to the vibrations of approaching prey. The plan, insofar as the operation had a plan, was almost elegantly stupid. Force Ghost Rider and the Xenomorphs into open combat. Wait for one side to weaken the other. Then intervene. Study the winner. Bring home the losers in pieces. Instead, everything went wrong. And it went wrong in the specific way that all such operations always went wrong, which is to say gradually, and then all at once. The hive did not respond the way the projections had suggested. When the sleeping drones woke, they did not organize into predictable attack waves. They erupted. Every level of the colony filled with sound at the same moment, a screaming chorus that vibrated through the walls and cracked the reinforced glass of the corporate observation posts. Thousands of xenomorphs, more than any recovered survey had ever suggested existed on this moon, poured out of the tunnels in a black tide. The Queen herself emerged from the deep chambers and turned, not toward Ghost Rider, but toward the human facility that had made itself so brightly, so foolishly, visible on the surface. The corporation soldiers held their line for exactly 20 seconds. Their pulse weapons flared. Their light lances carved brief red lines through the tide. Then the tide reached them, and the containment ring became a ruin. Vehicles were flipped. Pods were torn open before they could ever be used. Armored figures disappeared into the mass and did not come back. On the observation platforms above, the executives watching through drone feeds began, for the first time in their careers, to understand the exact meaning of the word irrelevant. Ghost Rider entered the battlefield through the middle of the collapsing perimeter. His motorcycle came down a ramp of shattered stone with its wheels already burning, and where the wheels touched the ground kept burning behind him. He drove into the swarm the way he had driven into the plaza, but this time the fight was different. This time he was not simply defending survivors. This time the entire moon was on fire, and the fire was spreading in directions no one had planned for. Because hellfire, once introduced into a xenomorph hive, did not behave the way any weapon in the corporation's arsenal behaved. It did not simply burn. It changed what it touched. The first drone consumed by Ghost Rider's flame did not merely die. It stood again briefly before crumbling. Its shell blackened, but a low light glowed beneath the surface. A second drone, splashed by the same fire, kept moving even after half its body had been reduced to ash. Its remaining limbs became longer, sharper, more articulate. Its eyeless head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its blood, when a corporate light lance carved it open, was no longer the familiar molecular acid. It glowed. It carried a color that had no name, a color that felt like something remembered from a dream that had never quite ended. The corporation had wanted to weaponize the moon's monsters. Ghost Rider, without intending to, had done it for them. And the result was so much worse than anything their scientists had ever imagined. The infernal xenomorphs began to spread across the battlefield in ones and twos, then in dozens. They moved faster than their unaltered kin. They ignored injuries that would have killed ordinary drones. They killed with a joy that the original species had never possessed, because the original species had never possessed joy at all. Something else was crawling into them along with the fire, some fragment of the corruption that had lived beneath this moon for millennia, some appetite that had finally found a vessel worth wearing. The Queen herself sensed it, and for the first time in her long reign she pulled her true children back, snarling, trying to protect the hive from its own transformation. Ghost Rider saw it too. And for the first time since he had arrived on this moon, something changed in the fire around him. The steady, patient heat that had defined his approach to every earlier encounter grew hotter. The chains in his hands began to sing at a higher pitch. His eyes narrowed inside their sockets of flame, and the survivors watching from the tunnels below felt the air pressure shift in a way that made their teeth ache. He understood in one long silent moment exactly what he had accidentally set in motion. If these new creatures escaped the moon, If even one of them boarded one of the corporation's evacuation ships and reached a populated system, the infection would not stop. It would spread. It would move from ship to station, from station to colony, from colony to homeworld, and the spirit of vengeance would spend the next 1,000 years chasing embers of his own fire across the width of human space. His purpose sharpened. It had been revenge once. It had been judgment. Now it became prevention. Now it became a single hard promise made silently to a universe that had not asked him to make it. Not one of these things would leave this moon. Not one flake of ash. Not one drop of glowing blood. He would burn every corridor and every tunnel and every hidden nest until the entire hive was a memory. And if he had to burn the moon along with it, he would do that too. The battle, which for all its scale had until now been only the opening chapter of his work here, finally became a war. Ghost Rider carved his way toward the heart of the hive with a patience that felt almost gentle. Every corridor he entered emptied itself of resistance within moments, its defenders either burning or fleeing. The infernal Xenomorphs, the new creatures born of his own fire, tried to hold the deeper tunnels against him, and failed as thoroughly as the ordinary drones had failed on the surface. The true children of the Queen, sensing something they had never been designed to sense, mostly parted before him. They did not understand what he was, but they had begun, in whatever fragmentary way their hive intelligence allowed, to understand what he intended to do to their mother. The chamber at the center of the hive was enormous. It had been carved out of the moon's bedrock centuries ago by claws and by the slow, patient chemistry of resin. Its walls curved upward into shadows that seemed to breathe. Its floor was uneven with the shapes of eggs, some empty, some intact, all of them silent now because the mother at the center of the room had commanded them to be silent. The Queen waited in the middle of it all, her long body coiled beneath her, her crown lowered, her second set of arms folded almost like the hands of a priest. She did not attack. She did not scream. She did not throw her drones at him in a final desperate wave. She watched. And in that watching there was a stillness that no other creature in the alien universe had ever managed to hold in the presence of the rider. She was not calm because she was unafraid. She was calm because she had decided, in whatever way a creature of her kind could decide, that fear was not going to serve her here. Something else might. So she waited to see what he would do. Ghost Rider stopped his motorcycle at the edge of the chamber. He dismounted slowly. The fire around him lowered its voice, though it never fully went out. He walked into the room the way a man walks into a courtroom that he has visited many times. And the Queen, through the vast shared consciousness of her hive, reached out toward him. Not with her body, with her mind. She had done this before to countless prey. She had reached into the memories of the humans her drones had captured. She had learned their languages, their fears, their tender private griefs. She had used those griefs to bait her traps, to make her ambushes more efficient, to make her killings feel, from the perspective of her victims, almost personal. Now she reached the same way toward Ghost Rider, and she was surprised by what she found. She did not find a beast. She found a man buried beneath a great deal of fire, but a man nonetheless. His name was Johnny Blaze, and his story was a long one, and the Queen received it all in the space of a single moment. She saw the young stunt rider on Earth. She saw the illness of a father, the desperate bargain with an old laughing thing that had called itself many names. She saw a life bent out of shape by regret, by loss, by the awful weight of having agreed to something that could never be unagreed. She saw the many small failures that had followed, the people he had loved and then had been unable to protect, the nights he had spent trying to remember what it had felt like to be simply human. The times he had come close to giving up entirely and had been dragged back into the world by nothing but the stubbornness of the fire inside him. She used it. She could not help using it. Her instinct, refined across countless millennia, was to find the weak point in any prey and to press on it until the prey broke. Johnny Blaze was the weak point. She showed him, in a moment of concentrated hallucination, every phase he had ever failed. She surrounded him with a chorus of quiet accusations that had lived inside him longer than the spirit of vengeance had. She reached, with a kind of terrible tenderness, into the small human heart that still beat somewhere beneath the fire, and she pulled it forward into the light. For a moment Ghost Rider staggered. The fire around him wavered. The chains in his hands dimmed. Johnny Blaze, briefly separate from Zarathos, stood in the center of the chamber and looked up at the Queen with the eyes of a tired man. His mouth was human again. His skin was skin. His shoulders sagged. The Queen struck. She struck with all the accumulated force of a species that had been perfecting the art of ambush for longer than any human civilization had existed. Her tail whipped forward. Her jaws opened. Her second inner mouth extended in that horrible telescoping motion that had ended so many stories on so many worlds. And she almost succeeded. She came within a hand's breadth of ending the story of Ghost Rider entirely, right there in the middle of her own chamber, and she would have written her name into the private legend of the demons of Earth if she had. She did not, because the fire came back. It came back the way fire always came back to him, quietly at first, then all at once. Johnny Blaze looked up. His eyes darkened. Somewhere behind those eyes, Zarathos remembered exactly what he had been sent into this universe to do. The skin peeled away from his face in a single hot instant, and the skull beneath was already burning by the time it emerged into the air. The battle that followed was the most brutal confrontation the story had yet contained. His chain wrapped around her neck. Her claws tore across his ribs and came away smoking. Her tail struck him hard enough to fold his motorcycle in half. His fire climbed her body in long, hungry ribbons that would have burned any other creature down to bone. She did not burn. She did not stop. She was old and she was strong and she had been designed to survive impossible things. So had he. They collided again and again, filling the chamber with the sound of grinding chitin, the sound of hissing acid, the sound of a fire that refused to be extinguished. At last, breathing hard, Ghost Rider stepped inside her guard. His hand closed around her lowered head. Their eyes met, and he used the one weapon he had been holding in reserve. The pennant stare. His gaze poured directly into the mind of the Queen. Every life her hive had ever consumed came rushing back into her at once. Every colonist, every soldier, every child who had been used as a host. Every animal, every stranger, every quiet person who had woken up on the wrong morning. The full weight of the suffering caused by her kind, across every world her drones had ever touched, condensed into a single infinite moment behind her eyes. Any human soul struck by that stare had always broken. Any demon had always fled. Any beast had always died on the spot. The Queen survived. She shuddered. She screamed. She curled inward on herself and clawed at the floor. But she survived. And Ghost Rider realized something that shifted the shape of the entire story he had been telling himself. The Queen did not experience guilt the way humans did. Her mind had no framework for remorse. She was not evil in the way the men who had made her were evil. She was instinct. She was hungry. She was a system, terrible and elegant, but a system. And systems could not be judged the way souls could. He lowered his hand slowly. She looked up at him, wounded, uncertain, still alive. And in the silence between them, both of them understood at the same moment that the true evil on this moon had never been her at all. Something else was still down there, in the dark beneath the chamber, and it had been listening to their entire battle with a great and terrible patience. The floor of the Queen's chamber cracked without warning. It did not crack in the way stone cracks under stress. It cracked the way skin cracks when something inside it has decided to be born. A single hairline fracture spread outward from a point directly beneath the mother's coiled body, and where it spread, the temperature of the world changed. Not upward, not downward, sideways into a register that no human sense had been designed to measure. Ghost Rider felt it immediately, and the Queen felt it a heartbeat later. And both of them turned their eyes downward at the same moment because both of them, in their very different ways, recognized what was rising. The chamber floor gave way in enormous slabs. The great stone circle that had been the base of the Queen's throne dropped into darkness. From the darkness, a light rose. It was not the fire of Ghost Rider. It was not the pale bioluminescence of the hive. It was a red that had no source, a red that seemed to come from inside the eyes of anyone who looked at it, a red that filled the chamber like a slow tide. And then in the middle of the red, the entity came out. It was not a xenomorph. It was not an engineer. It was not a human. It was not in any strict biological sense anything at all. It had shape only because the physical world insisted on shape. It reached upward with limbs that were not really limbs, with a body that seemed to change every time a mind tried to fix it in place. Sometimes it looked like a great column of writhing black light. Sometimes it looked almost like a figure, tall and terrible, with a face made from every face that had ever suffered on the moon. It moved without moving. It rose without rising. And it looked at Ghost Rider. It had been in the moon for thousands of years. The engineers had found it. The Xenomorphs had been one of its many gardens. It fed on biological conflict, on the small violent transactions of intelligent life, on wars and murders and quiet corporate betrayals, and the slow-burning cruelties of any species advanced enough to build a civilization and cynical enough to poison it. It did not need to act because acting would only draw attention. It preferred always to whisper, to nudge, to be the small extra weight on the wrong end of every difficult decision. Wherever life gathered in enough density to hurt itself, it had a hand in the hurting. Now, for the first time in its long patient existence, it had a reason to act, because it had never before encountered a spirit of vengeance. It had felt echoes across the void. It had tasted rumors of demons and of the men they possessed. But it had never before been in the same physical space as one, and the appetite that woke inside it when it saw Ghost Rider was something it had not felt in ages. It wanted him. Not to kill him, to eat him, to take everything the spirit of vengeance had ever consumed of suffering and vengeance and cosmic judgment, and to fold that terrible harvest into its own long, slow hunger. If it could do that, it would never sleep again. It would become the story rather than the whisper. Ghost Rider, in the same silent instant, understood why he had been called to this moon. It had not been the corporation. It had not been the hive. It had been the entity itself, reaching upward through the layered noise of the universe with a signal that only a very specific kind of visitor could hear. Something older than the spirit of vengeance had been waiting for him, and it had baited its trap with the exact bait he had never been able to refuse. The suffering of innocence, the corruption of the powerful, the presence of monsters. He had come as he always came because he had been unable not to. Above them the moon began to die, not all at once. The entity's awakening sent shock waves through the ancient structure that had contained it, and the structure had held only because the entity had let it hold. Now that it was rising, the walls that had kept it beneath the surface for millennia began to fold inward. Tunnels collapsed, chambers filled with rushing dust. The sky above the colony, seen through cracks in the surface, took on the same red color that had risen with the entity, as if the moon itself had been waiting all its life to bleed. The Xenomorph hive lost cohesion in ways that felt almost personal. Dead drones on the floor began to twitch, then to stand, their bodies reanimated by something that had never used them as hosts because it had never needed to. Corporate soldiers rose alongside them, still wearing their broken armor, their faces slack with expressions that no longer had anything to do with the people who had once lived inside them. The battlefield became a place where death itself had stopped meaning what death was supposed to mean. Any body was a mouth. Any silence was a whisper. Any shadow was a hand. Ava Reyes and her survivors, deep in a service corridor several levels above the Queen's chamber, felt the shift and understood immediately that something had changed in a way from which nothing could be walked back. Their skin crawled with an instinct older than their species. They ran toward the surface with a speed they had not believed they still possessed. Somewhere above them, corporate evacuation ships were already firing their engines, some of them lifting off with half-open ramps, some of them abandoning personnel on the ground rather than delay a takeoff by even 10 seconds. The moon had become a place from which every intelligent thing wanted to be somewhere else, and the somewhere else did not particularly matter as long as it was not here. Ghost Rider mounted his motorcycle. The chain in his hand grew heavier as he did, gathering weight from a well that was not physical. The Queen, still crouched at the ruined edge of her chamber, looked at him across the widening pit. He looked back at her. There was no communication between them, no shared language, no covenant. There was only a recognition. Both of them, in this moment, wanted the same thing. Both of them wanted the entity beneath them to stop existing. And both of them understood in a way that felt strange even to think that they were the only two beings on the moon capable of trying. The Queen rose to her full height. She turned toward her hive, toward the corridors filled with her true children, and she began to move. She did not lead them into battle against Ghost Rider. She led them out. She drove them upward with a series of low commands, using every trick of pheromone and posture she had ever learned, herding them away from the entity as if they were livestock she could no longer afford to lose. Some obeyed, some resisted. Some, already touched by the corruption spreading through the tunnels, turned on their own kin and had to be put down. But most of them followed her. The evacuation of the hive collided in the upper tunnels with the evacuation of the humans. Xenomorphs and colonists ran through the same corridors. Corporate soldiers and drones passed each other in the smoke without engaging, both sides too occupied with the terror behind them to remember the terror they had once been. A temporary alliance was born out of the simplest currency the universe had ever offered. It was not friendship. It was not trust. It was not even truce. It was only the shared, unspoken understanding that whatever was rising beneath them was worse than whatever they had been to each other, and that whatever came next would come for them all if it were not stopped. The moon shook with the birth of the entity. Great sheets of rock split away from its surface and drifted upward in slow tumbling arcs, held for a moment by the strange gravity of the awakening presence beneath, then flung outward into the black. The atmosphere, thin to begin with, began to boil away in visible ribbons that curled toward the horizon and vanished. In orbit, Weyland-Yutani's remaining ships lit their engines and ran without waiting for stragglers, and behind them, the moon began to look less like a world and more like a wound being pried open by patient hands. At the heart of the ruined colony, a temporary battle line formed. It was the strangest battle line in the recorded history of the alien universe, though of course no historian would ever be allowed to record it. On one side of a great collapsed square stood the last of the corporate soldiers, their weapons scavenged, their armor cracked, their commanders long since fled. Beside them, unwilling but present, stood a wave of the Queen's true children, their claws lowered, their heads bowed, their attention fixed on the pit at the center of the square rather than on the humans a few meters away. And in front of both of them, rising from a chasm in the ground, the entity gathered itself for its first real assault on the physical universe in a very long time. Ghost Rider drove into the square. His motorcycle was half melted at this point, its frame patched together with hellfire, its wheels riding on rings of pure light. He did not slow when he reached the front line. He went straight past it, past the humans, past the drones, and into the mouth of the pit itself. The Queen followed. She moved in the same silence with which she had watched him earlier, and where she went, the largest and oldest of her children went with her. An honor guard for a mother who understood that this was likely the last thing she would ever do. The entity met them at the edge of its own emergence. It threw itself upward in a great red pillar of shifting shapes, and from that pillar its physical manifestations began to peel away. Things with too many arms. Things with mouths where mouths did not belong. Things that looked, briefly, like specific dead people from the moon's history before dissolving back into red smoke. They struck at everything in reach. The Xenomorphs met them with claw and tail. The corporate soldiers, understanding at last what their contracts had never prepared them for, met them with the last of their ammunition and then with the rifles themselves swung like clubs. Above the moon, the retreating ships turned in orbit and opened fire, dropping precision munitions down through the thinning atmosphere in slow bright lines, bombarding the collapsing structure with the kind of firepower that no shareholder would ever be told they had authorized. Ghost Rider went deeper. He rode past the outer manifestations, past the false faces and the red smoke, into the core of the entity itself. The Queen went with him. Her body was cut in 100 places by the time they reached the true chamber. Black blood mixed with the red of the entity dripping from her long jaws. She should have died several times over. She did not. She followed him because instinct and something else, something none of her ancestors had ever developed a word for, had told her that this was the thing she had been born to do. Every hive needed a purpose beyond eating. Hers, for one brief final period, had found one. At the center of the entity's true body, Ghost Rider dismounted. He walked into a space that had no proper dimensions. The floor was not a floor. The ceiling was not a ceiling. The walls curved into themselves and continued curving forever. And around him, at the edges of the vision that was not really vision, the faces began. They were the faces of every victim connected to the moon. He saw the colonists who had been used as hosts, families and workers and children who had gone to sleep one night believing their contracts had been ordinary. He saw the scientists who had died in the initial containment breaches, some of them still holding their datapads, some of them wearing expressions of quiet horror that had never had time to become anything else. He saw the corporate soldiers who had been sent in to clean up the first outbreak and had not been told what they were cleaning. He saw the smallest faces, the ones the corporation had never officially acknowledged existed, the ones whose names had been redacted before their bodies had cooled. He saw the creatures too, the xenomorph young that had been experimented on, the failed hybrids that had lived brief agonized lives in cages before being dissected while still moving. Every death became fuel. Every face fed the fire. The spirit of vengeance, which had grown across many centuries by consuming the guilt and terror of countless souls, drank the accumulated suffering of this moon and grew in a way that would have terrified the demons of its own home if they had been watching. The entity spoke. It did not use language. It used the shape of language poured directly into the mind of the being it faced. It told Ghost Rider that vengeance was meaningless. It told him that no punishment ever balanced any crime, that every judgment was only another act of harm added to the great total, that the universe kept no ledger and never had. It told him, with something almost like tenderness, that the fire he carried had never actually saved anyone. It had only redistributed the suffering. It had only made the total slightly larger. It offered him rest. It offered him an end to the endless work. It offered him the peace of finally admitting what a small voice inside Johnny Blaze had always suspected, that none of it had ever mattered. Ghost Rider did not answer with words. He never did. He answered by lifting his chain. He answered by tightening his grip on the handlebars of a burning motorcycle. He answered by looking one more time into the faces at the edges of the not-quite chamber and letting each of them see him seeing them. He told the entity, without ever opening his mouth, that punishment was not about hatred. It had never been about hatred. Hatred was for beings who were still deciding what to do. Punishment was for beings who had already decided. Punishment was consequence. Punishment was the universe answering, in whatever voice it had left, that some acts required an answer regardless of whether the ledger balanced. He told it that if the total of harm was already infinite, then his fire was only another drop in that ocean. And that was fine, because the drop was still the right drop, and the drop was still his to place. Then he used the penance stare on it. The stare did not need eyes to work. It did not need proximity. It reached across the shape of the entity's not-quite body and forced it to experience, at last, every life it had ever fed on. Not the xenomorph victims, not only the colonists. Every conflict on every world within the vast reach of its hunger, every quiet murder, every corporate crime, every soldier crying in the dark of a war that had happened only because the entity had nudged the wrong minds at the wrong moments. Millennia of harvested suffering folded back into the harvester in a single moment. The entity, which had spent its entire existence eating without ever tasting, tasted for the first time, and it did not survive the meal. It began to collapse. Its manifestation, still fighting on the surface, softened and slowed and lost coherence. Its red light dimmed, its shape unraveled. Ghost Rider, standing at the center of the not-quite chamber, unleashed everything he had held in reserve since he had first arrived on this moon. Hellfire poured from his hands, from his chains, from his eyes, from every inch of his skeletal frame. The core of the entity ignited. The moon ignited with it. Above him, the Queen understood without being told what he was doing and what it would cost. She turned. She used the last of her authority over her hive to drive her surviving children into a long, spiraling formation, a living tunnel of chitin and claw that carved an escape route through the collapsing corridors toward the surface. Human survivors, corporate stragglers, and any drone that would follow. All of them poured through the tunnel she made with her body and the bodies of her oldest guards. Many of the xenomorphs died holding the walls of that tunnel open. She stood at its opening, her great head raised, watching them go. She did not follow. Ghost Rider rode upward through a moon that was breaking apart around him. The tunnels widened as they collapsed. Sections of the surface tore open above him and let in the black. He rode past the ruins of the plaza where he had first defended Ava Reyes and her survivors. He rode past the observation platforms where the executives had watched their empire spend itself. He rode past the last of the corporate ships as they climbed away, their engines desperate, their captains no longer even pretending to give orders. The moon exploded behind him. A silent flower of red and gold bloomed against the black, its petals shaped by the last collapse of the entity's dying manifestation and the last combustion of the spirit of vengeance's outpoured fire. The final image, captured by a single distant orbital camera that would later be quietly deleted from every corporate archive, but never quite from the memory of the technician who had reviewed the footage, showed a figure on a burning motorcycle riding across the disintegrating surface of a dying world, straight into the open dark of space, and not looking back. The survivors reached human space in silence. Their evacuation ships limped into distant stations weeks later, undermanned, half-fueled, filled with people who had spent the entire journey trying to arrange the memories inside their heads into an order that another human being might believe. Weyland-Yutani was waiting for them. Debriefing rooms had already been prepared. Contracts had already been rewritten. New non-disclosure clauses drafted overnight by nervous lawyers sat in neat stacks beside cups of cold tea. The corporation had a great deal of experience erasing its own catastrophes, and it applied every technique it had ever developed to this one. It offered money. It offered promotions. It offered, when necessary, the quiet threat of losing everything if the wrong story ever reached the wrong ears. For once, it did not entirely work. Too much evidence had survived. Fragments of helmet camera footage had been backed up to civilian relays in the panic of the retreat. Recovered pieces of engineer technology, salvaged by survivors in the last moments before the moon died, had been quietly passed to independent researchers who had no particular loyalty to any corporation. And somewhere, on a single corrupted data chip that had passed through 3 sets of hands before finally being pinned to the wall of a scientist's private lab, there was one impossible image. A burning figure on a motorcycle, riding through the collapsing corridors of an exploding xenomorph hive. The corporation labeled the incident a containment failure. It used all the correct language. Isolated event. Unrepeatable circumstances. Now safely contained by the loss of the affected site. The survivors, when they spoke of it among themselves in the years that followed, called it something different. They called it a warning. A signal not from the moon, but through it. A message from a universe that had finally decided to send an answer. The Xenomorph Queen's fate was never officially resolved. Some of the survivors, Ava Reyes among them, believed she had died in the collapse of her chamber, that her long, strange final act of leading her hive into an alliance with humanity had been also her end. Others believed differently. Rumors traveled quietly through the outer colonies for years afterward, stories of small hives appearing in unexpected systems. Hives whose behavior did not quite match the standard patterns of the species. Hives that seemed to remember something no Xenomorph Queen should have been able to remember. No one confirmed the stories. No one entirely dismissed them either. Ghost Rider himself disappeared from human space. He did not return to Earth. He did not seek out any of the survivors, and none of them expected him to. He did not join any faction, sign on to any ship, or accept any place at any table. He did what his kind had always done. He listened. And when another signal reached him, softer than the one that had brought him to that ruined moon, but carrying the same essential note, the note of innocent lives crying out into silence, he followed it. Somewhere beyond the stars, another world was suffering. He rode toward it without ceremony, the way a decision walks toward its own completion. The final thought that hung over the survivors and over the corporation that had tried and failed to bury them, and over the quiet historians who would one day try to piece the story together from fragments, was always the same. The Xenomorphs had been designed to be the ultimate predators. They had been the endpoint of an entire civilization's obsession with weaponized life. They had spread across the dark places of the galaxy for a very long time, hunting humanity, hunting each other, hunting anything that moved. They had no natural fear, no mercy, no conscience. They had learned over generations exactly how to make an entire species afraid of the dark. They had never once encountered a hunter whose purpose was not survival, not territory, not appetite, but judgment itself. They had never encountered something that hunted evil. Somewhere in the outer reach of an unmapped system, a distant colony went about its ordinary evening. Lights came on in windows. A child laughed in a courtyard. A shift worker cursed at a broken vending machine. On the edge of that colony, in the empty static of a private communications channel, a transmission arrived without a sender. It carried no words, only a low, patient sound. The sound of a motorcycle engine idling in the dark. The technician on duty leaned forward, frowning, and turned up the gain. The engine grew louder. Then, in the black of the monitor, two small points of light appeared. They burned steadily. They did not blink. They watched. Somewhere behind those eyes, an old promise was being kept. The universe, for all its vastness, had never been silent. It had always been listening. And when its listening finally answered, it answered on wheels of fire, wrapped in chains that had never learned to rust, wearing the skull of a man who had once agreed to something terrible so that someone he loved might live. The Xenomorphs had spent millions of years becoming the perfect organism. They simply weren't prepared for the perfect punishment.